Welcome to the Corporate Venturing Insider Series, where I interview top practitioners in the CVC world and learn with you the best practices and golden nuggets that they have accumulated over their career. In this episode, we will be learning from Alejandro Solé, CIO of TechEnergy Ventures. Alejandro, could you take a few minutes to share your story and how you got to where you are today?
Thank you, Nicolas, for having me. My journey into corporate venture has been, I would say, a story that starts more from the energy space. I've spent most of my career working in the energy sector in different roles. And then ultimately, I think corporate venture capital allowed me to combine the two things that I like. That also includes an entrepreneurial slash impact aspect to the work that I do. But yeah, I grew up in Buenos Aires, Argentina. I studied economics. I was mainly a sailor at the time, and I was sailing around the world. And when I was about to graduate, one of my sailing partners who was an executive in the energy space, offered me to join his investment banking firm in Texas. It was very far from home. He basically was turning around TXU, which is a large public utility, and needed some help. And so I moved to Texas and I started in banking, restructuring companies in the utility space, power, and then oil and gas. And ultimately, I had the opportunity to join this venture, this new fund, which kind of combined also the entrepreneurship element that I've had for many years in different aspects. And that's how I ended up in corporate venture.
Okay, very nice. Now, one thing you didn't mention, and I'm not sure if it's because it's irrelevant to your job, but I doubt it, is your educational background. Do you mind sharing about what you've learned from your economics degree and the MBA you did, and how it's shaping you to be a better investor?
Yes, absolutely. I think obviously in the energy space and in particular in the tech space in corporate, you're surrounded by scientists and engineers most of the time. To me, as an economist, I am more concerned about, for example, the relative prices of energy, right? And things that are more from an economic perspective.
Mm.
I tend to try to stay away from just trying to quantify things, KPIs that end up on a volumetric basis and not actually end up to a levelized cost. I want to put everything into a cost or a price. And I always think about or try to think about that might be the answer in one place of the world, but it might be very different somewhere else. And that has affected me also because of where I did my different work experiences. I spent many years at Bain as well, doing energy in Brazil, in Argentina, and in Mexico. I've been through the deregulation of 3, 4 markets in the power space. So ultimately, I always tend to think about why, where, and how that changes the ultimate solution for any climate solution you're trying to implement. So I think typically I'm the guy that only wants to see dollar figures, or I want everything to ultimately finish on an economic number. I think it's that translation work that I hope to do and how I hope to help my team trying to get to that last, definite perspective by translating many concepts from different parts of feedback that you receive. There's always these examples, and as you know, we're developing, for example, some lithium assets in the north of Argentina. And then I think the engineers and the scientists have spent less time exposed to these situations and therefore are always less, I would say, less focused on how these dynamics might be different in different places. So hopefully this is something that I help the team with.
Actually, I think it's a golden nugget, maybe. But Alejandro, let's go back to corporate venturing. And do you mind explaining your role and what is Tech Energy Ventures and how it started?
Absolutely. I'm currently the Chief Investment Officer at TechEnergy Ventures. TechEnergy Ventures is the corporate venture of the energy company of Techint Group. And Techint, it's a large steel, energy, and construction group of companies, privately owned, roughly 100,000 employees, 40 billion revenue, and with a strong presence in Latin America. Historically, it's been a steel player. So big challenge to decarbonize. The shareholders recognize that 95% of their EBITDA is linked to, let's call them, old legacy industries. And they have the ambition to participate in this new economy, and they have the ambition to be a leader in cleaning up their operations as well. So 4 years ago, the group decided to launch an energy transition division. And then very rapidly, they realized that they also needed a venture arm because many opportunities were still, let's call them, out of the money.
Hmm.
And investing in early staging hardware would enable them to have, I call it a privileged window into the future and to prepare to understand where they want to go and where there might be deployment opportunities when those technologies get to maturity. I joined the group in 2021 to launch the fund. We've invested so far in 17 companies. We do things like geothermal, energy storage, carbon management, clean hydrogen, fuels, and critical minerals. We are doing a lot in the lithium space, so therefore also in the battery value chain. Argentina has one of the best brine resources in the world, and we have a lot of history with Argentina. But ultimately, the group likes big scale assets. We believe that clean technologies will scale, and we want to be asset developers of those clean technologies when they're ready.
First, I think it's inspiring, and two, I think it's very forward looking for what I think is typically an industry where incumbents don't try to change anything or move anywhere. So, 4 years ago, clearly a desire from the top management to prepare for the future. I want to double click on what you said, the privileged window of opportunity. Can you share a bit more what you mean by that?
Yeah, absolutely. It goes in hand with the idea of putting your feet on the water. And it's very difficult to observe and really learn just by reading the headlines. You actually need to get your feet in the water to understand, for example, how fast battery costs are coming down, why, and how far they can get. And what does that mean then for the implementation of those solutions? So, all the time, we're pivoting in the fund between what we learn from the texts that are getting developed to what they mean in our geographies of preferences. We play a lot the game of saying, when that technology gets to what point, we'll be able to have an asset development go to an FID of $500 million to get built and make money in this climate, in this energy transition. And obviously, the more you spend time with your portfolio, the more you engage and the more you work to try to actually build these specific cases. And as the technology matures, the expectation of what do these cases mean evolve, right? So maybe when you start and you invest in a TRL4, you say, early stage out of the lab, you say, well, if you check these boxes, this kind of looks like the use case and this will be competitive. Then when they get to the next phase and they build a pilot plant, you start thinking about where am I going to put this plant? What geography that I mean actually makes sense? And then hopefully we're going to be evolving. And we spend a lot of time with this concept of the bridge that we try to build.
And today you're part of that energy transition division, the CVC. So the strategic remit is very clear. It's about preparing the big mothership, oil and gas, to be ready for this energy transition we are seeing happening. And so that bridge concept, how does it work in practice? Is that people in your team interacting with the rest of the bigger mothership, or is it the energy transition division that's doing it? How do you create this bridge? Because most of CVCs struggle with creating the right bridge, which are both efficient and effective.
I'll start by making the disclosure that we're very young. So we build a hypothesis of how this should work, and we're working on it, and it's obviously work in progress, and we're there to tune it up as we can. So today, the way we're organized is our team and the investor that is the expert in the vertical builds the model and the framework and gets the data feed in collaboration with the local teams that provide all the specifics. And therefore, together we build the case. I think we take a little bit more ownership now because we don't want to have to do all the transfer of know-how, but we lever as much as we can the local knowledge to come together with a common recommendation that will be an outcome, for example, right?
So I can see the visual of the bridge, which is you have these two very different worlds. One which is very applied, it's about assets and exploitation, and then the other side, which is all about the future, and there's very little data to prove it, and you need that bridge between the two. Now, what I'm assuming is that bridge, and actually you've alluded to it, some of your mothership experts can come in and bring so much insight that no entrepreneurs, no startups could ever have because they don't have this asset management experience. How do you make this into something that's so valuable for the startup they want to get your investment?
No, absolutely. It's a critical point. Um, when we also invest in steel companies, right? And one of the things that we always do is we invite them to come to our steel shops. And when they come to our steel shops, they see these cities, right? That there's always this kind of shock.
Now, let's talk about the launch of the CVC. So clearly, you joined for the launch. And I wonder, especially for the audience who are thinking about joining a CVC or launching a CVC, especially in a very mature type of company, in a very mature type of industry, what would be the questions you think they should be asking before doing so?
Yeah, I think my experience launching the CVC had two parts. The first one was mandate, so clarity around mandate, and I would say less well defined funds, which do not have a clear mandate. And I think that very well leads to all these funds that do not survive more than one CEO. I think we all know, I think the stat is 30-40%. That was the mandate that I got. It was a 20-page document to the first investment committee where I tried to go to 100 feet and say, okay, this is now you said this. We all agree that we're trying to exactly do these three things. If we were saying that the objective of the fund was to build new business development opportunities, or for example, decarbonize the group, what came first? Because you're starting a new team, you have
Mhm.
limited resources, you're trying to invest at the same time, you're trying to make the business case, at the same time, you're trying to share the knowledge and know-how with the organization. If you really think about it, the amount of work that you do in a CVC, it's significantly, I don't want to say more, but it has more elements than a straight up financial VC with its advantages and its disadvantages. So obviously, for us, there are things that are off the table. They don't fit a strategic mandate.
Yeah. So maybe actually share with us how was your first investment committee? What was the type of conversation you did not expect and was maybe harder than you expected, or something that actually was a delight for you?
Yes, I think the team and myself specifically, and then we find out the IC as well, was eager to get something done, to put one chip on the table. There was an investment process that needed to be tested. There was a team that needed to be tested. So obviously, I remember we launched the website on January 15, and we went to our first committee early April. And it was very fast. It was obviously a small investment. It was 1% allocation, but it was an opportunity that we didn't want it to build a large exposure, but we did want to build some exposure and some knowledge. Then I remember the IC saying, specifically, we have an independent director that says the IC needs to be ready to receive documents 48 hours in advance and vote. And when I heard that, I was like, wow. I never thought that they were really ready to move this fast.
And you're talking, I'm sure, about very senior people who have very busy schedules. So I think setting that expectations, we have the same at TDK Ventures. Within 48 hours, we need to be able to assemble the IC and to vote. But we don't abuse it.
Yeah,
We try to give as much time as possible, but sometimes you need to be able to move fast.
no, absolutely. It was a delight to see that they were ready to walk the talk. And that
Mm.
means that the conversation of the IC, it's much more acute. And actually it helps you uh, really gain conviction or just now realize that maybe it's not the right decision.
So maybe you can talk to me about how did you manage to educate, or maybe they were already there, for your investment committee members to understand that venture capital is so different an approach to what would be projects in your mothership.
I think we were lacking some aspects because there was a precedent through which the group had invested in the past, but only as an LP on a non-strategic venture. So there was already some gymnastics of understanding timing and levels of risks, and the idea that the portfolio was going to have somewhere north of 50% of failures.
So they'd been exposed early.
Exposed, briefed, some combination of the two. Some had experience in that fund, one of the members. The
Mm.
other ones were very well briefed. And together with Andrea Roca, who is the head of the energy transition division, he also did a very good job at being very upfront during the entire beginning of the communication of the fund, not only within the IC, but within the broader ecosystem of, yeah, we're making this investment, this is venture capital. More than half of the companies we invest will go bankrupt, he would say, right? You need to understand the levels of risk, right?
Yeah.
Because it's not only the IC that maybe spends the most time, but then it's the entire ecosystem of people that get engaged with you, dedicate time, help you with that due diligence, that maybe help you follow through the technology progress of a startup that you're at. You got to keep everyone in the same boat of leveling the expectations, because if not, they help us with the due diligence, they follow the company, then they go bankrupt, and this was a waste of time. And hopefully, you have already helped them understand that it's a process through which this is the normal, and that it's always an iteration of learning that hopefully you're building to always make better and better decisions.
So I've learned something which I didn't know, which is your mothership had done an LP investment into a financial VC, which leads me to maybe a question for the audience, especially let's say you're the CEO of an oil and gas company. Does it make sense to do LP investments first to learn and to have your own executives learning about venture type investments? Or is it better to start with a CVC right away? Because from what you've described, it helped the mindset of your investment committee to have done that first LP investment. So, how would you think about you're the CEO of an oil and gas company, you're thinking about or you're worried about what could disrupt you and you want to create a CVC? What would be the step? LP first or CVC first? Or CVC doing the LP?
Yeah, I think the first question is around size of appetite. It's
Mm-hmm.
very difficult to manage a CVC if you're not willing to put, I would say, $100 million on the table, some number that allows you to effectively participate.
Yeah.
So I think if you're still unsure and you're willing to put 20, $30 million, I would decide against having your own fund. Just the economics are not going to work. If you want to put a team with technical capabilities, you're going to spend some money. And if you don't have some strength, then it's very difficult to get access. So I would say if you're thinking about getting just a smaller chip to start, I think finding some LPs as a first experience can be helpful. On the other hand, I find it challenging for an LP position to get the full perks out of an investment.
Yeah. That cannot work the same way. You might have a meeting or two, but that would never be that kind of deep dive into how the two teams would work together.
So I think ultimately, if you're fully committed to leveraging tech to build the next phase of your organization, we did the analysis. We looked at merit funds. We had a metric called the affinity metric. We would take the portfolio of any energy financial VC and say how many of these deals we would have done. First, on a segment based, just because of the segment, without judging whether the company you like it or not. Just would you have invested in this type of tech, right? And then we would measure that against our strategic objectives. And if it wasn't north of 40%, we wouldn't really think about it.
I think it's a very good, it's a golden nugget, which this affinity metric, which is from the portfolio of a VC, you would consider doing an LP investment. So clearly, you've talked about how quickly you can move for an investment. So let's go back to the advantage and disadvantage against financial VC. What do you perceive as your disadvantage against financial VCs?
Yeah, the first one I would say is that there are companies that would rather have financial players in general because they believe that the longevity of the teams it's longer. So typically, you do a deal with a partner, and the partner will always be there, and they will say that, who's going to be there tomorrow at TechEnergy Ventures, right? So I think some entrepreneurs perceive that today they're doing a deal with someone, but it's not a partner and maybe tomorrow it's not there, or maybe the philosophy of the fund changes, or maybe the corporate changes its mandate. So stability and longevity from a financial investor, from the right financial investor, is something that I think sometimes entrepreneurs prefer. And hopefully we balance that with specific segment knowledge to offset that. I think the second one is talent pool that wants to work in financial VC. I think it's a different mandate. I think it's a different task. But there's a talent pool that is obviously very good that wants to do that. And obviously they have great professionals that come with a lot of financial investment. They probably have a longer track record. If you take the average amount of years that my team has invested relative to the average financial VC, you realize that our team has a shorter experience. They have a lot more engineering experience, and maybe they have a lot more knowledge around certain power markets, but they definitely have a shorter tenure. And financial VCs, some of them have been here doing climate for 20 years. They have better access in general. And this is a very tough segment because if you invest in the seed round, it might be a fund returner. The same investment at the A round, it's a great investment, but it's not a fund returner anymore.
Yeah, and I think access is so critical, and you're right. Financial VCs that have been involved from the very beginning, Cleantech 1.0 actually was successful. It's just that it took 20 years versus 5 years. But if you are an early investor in, let's say, Tesla, you have a Tesla mafia starting startups in so many places, and having access to them is a real advantage. Now, let's talk about something that both financial VCs and strategic VCs do, which is to bring value on the board. But entrepreneurs might perceive a strategic on the board very differently. Can you talk about how do you address this with the entrepreneurs? How do you share with them how you plan to bring value on the board?
Yes, I think there's the first part of the pitch, right? So when you're looking at the company and you're building the case of how that's going to add value to you and should translate directly to adding value to them. There should be that link. It's very difficult to build a case where, oh, this is a great strategic investment to me, but it means nothing to you, right? You gotta be really upfront and transparent on how you think you can add value, why and when. A lot of entrepreneurs look at us and say, oh, we're going to put a plant in one of your facilities. So we try to be very transparent about what it takes to put a plant in our facility, not to create false expectations, because otherwise you close the investment and you go to the first board and they're like, sign me this pilot agreement. And I'm like, you're still pretty far out from being ready to put in a pilot plant. So
Yep.
that, and when you think that a collaboration will be ready and will make sense is very important.
It's a golden nugget. You have to set the right expectations on what you can bring and when.
Absolutely. Then the other one is if there is a potential perceived issue of conflict, also be very upfront. I think it comes with a previous disclosure, but if we're saying we're going to build assets in Mexico and the entrepreneur is saying, I want to build an asset in Mexico, you need to address that upfront and say, you know what, let's talk about how we would actually do something, even if it's a little bit earlier, because is there compatibility in our ambitions? It's actually in our scorecard. That their business model, even though it can change, and I strongly believe that you really don't know what business model you can pursue until the technology gets some maturity. But once you become an investor, there's all these things that appear that so far have proven to add value probably beyond what the entrepreneur expected and what we thought that we could add value to. Some things is just more pure helping them with the management. Sometimes it's helping them with the recruiting. Sometimes it's helping them by having expert calls with our teams. So earlier on, we find different ways to provide value in things that were less thought up front, but in the day to day prove to be of value to both of us.
You touched on something interesting, which we're discovering as well as TDK Ventures, which is sometimes there are some what we call TDK goodness, value we bring to our portfolio companies. So you invest early stage, but you have a private equity background. How do you reconcile the two? Because right now you're talking about being exhaustive, but there's so much you don't know early stage, there's so much uncertainty. How do you reconcile the two, or how do you benefit from your private equity background to be a better early stage investor? I'm sure the audience, we will have some late stage investors very curious about this.
Yeah, I think my first disappointment, quote unquote, was to see that all the agreements were standard. I was ready to make all these complicated structures to mitigate my risk, but here you can't really do that. So I think in general, it's a little bit of a different mindset. I think obviously in private equity, you go very deep into certain topics
Mm.
because you cannot tolerate a failure. Here, you have to have a higher tolerance for failure. On the other hand, obviously, when you look at private equity, you're targeting 4 to 6x to have a portfolio that has 2 to 3x. And here it's a complete different game. So I think I would say more learnings have to do also with the portfolio management because I've been more exposed to seeing companies in growth phase. So when you discuss with entrepreneurs, you do bring, let's say, a forward look into things that will happen in their future. I think in the due diligence, you you use less your knowledge around due diligence and how deep you go in private equity, but you still bring some perspective of how does this need to look in 5 6 years to actually build an attractive business. The thinking was that obviously you can have an ambition, and the ambition is always going to be to try to eat as much of that TAM as you can, but ultimately your place in the value chain will be determined by how much better you are than others, right? If you're holding the golden key to a door to a segment, yeah, the ambition should be to own the segment.
My last question is going to be touching this, which is with uncertainty of business model and go to market, how do you build high conviction? Because that was your point earlier, which is it's a high conviction game. How do you do that?
I'll start by saying what characterizes our DNA that is very technical, like the
Yep.
group. And that has proven also to be challenging sometimes. I very much like people that say team, market, tech, and the team will solve everything. I sometimes the counter view of that is wrong technical path, very difficult to fix. So I think the first thing is understanding what are you betting on at that startup, and what does the segment actually need. Is this a segment that will go through a technology disruption, and you're talking about new technologies that are order of magnitude better? There's obviously a technology element. You got to focus on who's actually going to be executing this. And then there's some segments in the middle where the market might not be big enough. And I will say that we take the strategic card and we say maybe the market is not big enough, but this would be fantastic for us to have in our portfolio because we can think of infinite ways to create value with this.
I love your answer and I like the granularity you bring to these questions. Alejandro, thank you for your time. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Nicolas. It was a lot of fun, and hope to see you soon.